and that is the Charter School Task Force report. You guys, I don't want to read the whole thing. I don't think you want to hear my voice for a good hour or so to go through this, but I want to bring your attention to the packet. And in the packet, you will find an executive summary, a charter school task force consensus statement, a really interesting chart that we can explain, and then some other supporting information that the task force used. I'm going to spend time on the executive summary, and I'm going to read it here, but I'm not going to read the whole thing. Okay, the Charter School Task Force was established by the Utah State Board of Education for the purpose of addressing improvements to charter school accounting standards, operations, and finances. As part of its work, the task force reviewed provisions in Utah Code, Board Administrative Rules, concepts and purpose statements, and articles regarding use of accounting standards promulgated by the Financial Accounting Standard Board, FASB, and the Government Accounting Standards Board, GASB, so FASB, GASB, and received a report from an outside consultant on how many states require charter schools to use FASB versus GASB accounting standards, and what entity structure other states use for charter schools, i.e. private nonprofit corporations, private for-profit corporations, governmental nonprofit corporations, or governmental entity. The task force met 9 times, beginning September 30th and ended on December 2nd, 2019. And this we ended based on what the board that said that they wanted a report by this board meeting, or we would. There's plenty of work that still that could have been done. The task force members comprised of the following: Utah State Board of Education board members, Chair Mark Huntsman, Laura Belknap, and Cindy Davis. Legislators were Senator Dan McKay, Senator Kathleen Ruby, Representative Karen Kwan, and Representative Jefferson Moss. State Charter School board members, Chair Kristen Elenkowski, Vice Chair Delana Tonks, and Cindy Phillips. State Auditor's Office, State Auditor John Dougal and Jeremy Walker. State Treasurer's Office, State Treasurer David Damshin, Emily Barton, and Kurt, is it Slaw or Slaw? I always call him Kurt, but I think it's Slaw. Charter School stakeholders, Justin Riggs, Charter School Director, Stephanie Archibald, Charter School Business Manager, Carol Hershey, Charter School Board Member, David Strait. Oh, I'm reading these wrong. And then Charter School Teacher was, I think, was that David Strait? AAGs was Michelle Buse, Brian Quisenberry, and David Jones. USBE staff, Angie Stalling, Scott Jones, Debbie Davis, Patty Norman, Michelle Clark. Yeah, they get that. Jacob Hartrow, Jennifer Lambert, Ben Rasmussen, Stuart Okabia, Cammie Wilcox, and Kathy Elgeson. Other invited guests, Royce Van Tassel, who's with the Utah Association of Public Charter Schools, and Terry Shoemaker, Utah School Boards Association, Utah Schools Superintendents Association. Okay, so everyone's been anxious to see what the results are of that task force after a lot of deliberation, and we have these recommendations. The first recommendation is to require charter schools to use Governmental Accounting Standards Board, or GASB, accounting standards. That's number one. And then there's some other information that supports that that's in this document. The second was charter school entity structure remain as private nonprofit entities with statutory changes and clarifications. So we're not wanting to change that, change their entity, which most of them are 501c3s, but we're asking to make some statutory changes and clarifications to that. The next is that the board continue a discussion of governance, oversight, and monitoring of charter schools. So those are the three recommendations. As you get more into the document, you'll see there's within that recommendation, there's a consensus statement, and they're all listed out, as you'll see, in that there's 8 of them. And I'm not sure if you want to read all of them. The consensus statement, the reason that we had this consensus statement is that as we move on a recommended action, that as this goes to committees and as we move forward, that for the board, as they were moving forward, that they can refer back to the consensus statements that were made from the charter task force. So if somebody says, well, what did the charter school task force think about that or say about that? We can quickly go to the consensus statement as a guide to reference their work. Now, before I make this motion, or before I seek a motion, because I'm chairing, I can't make a motion. I was hoping we had this scheduled so Brittany would be chairing and I could make that motion. I want to thank, is Juliana Christie here? Will you stand up? Who is our facilitator? Thank you. We really appreciate the good job that you did in that. Thank you. And then we have online, we have other people that's been all part of that task force here, and it was a lot of work. You guys remember how many meetings that we met? That was, I believe, 9, and they were 3 hours of intense discussion, and a lot of it was educational, and we brought back other information to help them become informed in these recommendations and also in their consensus statement. So when you see these members, I'm going to send out a thank you letter, but I've learned a lot about these individuals, and they've learned a lot about the concerns that each other have had. So again, I appreciate all the work that they have done, and also staff. It's a lot of meetings and a lot of prep and fast turnaround. So board members, I know that you have had access to the consensus statements and that, and with that, and then we'll get into discussion, but I want to put this out here. The motion that I'm seeking is that the board thank the Charter School Task Force for its work and report, accept the task force recommendations, and direct board leadership to facilitate action related to the recommendations, including assigning potential action items to standing committees. So I'm seeking that. So, okay, thank you. Okay, discussion to that motion. But Board Member Cindy Davis.
I'd like to speak to the motion. There was a lot of study that went into this. There are a lot of areas that still could be studied, but I really appreciate the way that our charter director, the input from our charter directors and our charter state school board. I learned a lot from them, actually, that I did not know in the past, and I think these are great recommendations. So I'm going to support these recommendations.
Board Member Bolter.
Sorry, I'm just trying to understand the number 4, where we can subpoena financial records. And then what do we mean, like, if we place them on warning, or if the state charter school board?
Your question
places
is on
them
number 4?
Yes, when it says notice of concern or is placed on warning or probation, is that like after the state charter school board has placed?
We have staff here that sounds a lot better than I do. So Angie, will you answer that question, please?
Thank you, Chair Huntsman, board members. Good morning. Angie Stallings, Deputy Superintendent of Policy. Yes, it is related to, this is actually a request that the State Charter School Board was already planning to make to the legislature. And you'll see that if you look at the consensus document, which is statement document, which is also on Civic Clerk, you'll see that a couple of these requests have parentheses, and actually these two related to seeking subpoenas to get information, were originally ideas from the State Charter School Board, and they presented those to the task force and added the USBE in there as somebody who could also request a subpoena. The process would be going to the state auditor and asking the state auditor to issue the subpoena and get the records. Go ahead.
No, I understand that. I'm
Yeah.
just trying to clarify that we wouldn't be placing them on probation or whatever. It's after a vote was taken with the state
Correct.
charter board, and then we would have the opportunity.
Correct.
Okay.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I'm giving too much information.
No, that's fine, but that was really good information also.
Okay. Board Member Jenny Earl.
Yeah, I just have a question about the auditor's latest draft. Do we have that for his recommendations? There was a question on that,
Well, Scott, do you want to?
or talk about that a little bit so we're aware of what that exactly is.
Deputy Superintendent of Operations, Scott Jones, we're aware of the audit alert, and I've actually reviewed it myself. My plan is to follow up with Auditor Dougal. I don't see that the board can't still make these recommendations, right? I mean, by doing so, we will further the process of coming to terms and getting to what right is as far as all of the recommendations, and then honoring as well the auditor's, proposal or his recommendations as well through the audit alert. So we're going to have to come to terms with that. It just was released, I think, a few days ago.
Okay, I was just going to ask if
Yeah,
that,
we're
I
aware
didn't see
of
that
it,
in our
and
packet.
yes.
Okay,
Yes, ma'am, and we're gonna, I was telling another individual that asked me about it, if it would come up in here, that this is how I would respond, is that we're just gonna need to follow up with Auditor Dougal. From my vantage point, it's a disparity, right? FASB versus GASB, the recommendations of the task force, and then the way ahead there. But I think, echoing Board Member Davis's comments about just how much interaction and research and things like that, I think we can still work or process together. Personally, I would recommend that you still proceed with your recommendations, because more of this will get developed as we progress together and move together into the legislative session, subject to their willingness and adaptability on the code changes that we're recommending as well. So I hope
can I
that
ask a
helps.
question?
Yeah, follow.
So your recommendation is that we reconcile some other time, what those differences are? Is that what I'm?
Yeah, I recommend you go ahead and, for the motion, go ahead and make the board's recommendations, right? Or, support the recommendations of the task force, and that by virtue of that, and then also considering our, partners in this, i.e. the auditor's office, that we move together on, and still continue to work on whatever disagreements or misunderstandings we might have about the application of FASB versus GASB. That's what I recommend.
Okay.
And then if I might add, from being on the task force and that, with all of the dialogue, it's a tough place because the 501c3 side of it is a private, but yet you're in this public arena, and so all of whatever's volleying back and forth, what is the best fit? By moving forward on this will be happening in committee and/or with a bill file or something, whatever we choose to do as a board, that conversation's still gonna happen, and following the auditor was in on all of this. When we talk about these as being consensus, it's a general consensus, but not everybody totally agrees with every one of these items that was on here. But in that arena, it was the previously, the auditors said, oh, everything's gonna go GASB, and now with this other law, it's going this way. So there's gonna be more dialogue on, again, what right looks like and what best serves that, but that's all gonna be done in very open committee meetings of what will best serve. You know, we're still going back, what's best for students, what's best for teachers, what's best for taxpayers, what's best on the accounting side. So I hope that answers your question. The discussion isn't over. And the way that the recommendations are that are coming, my recommendation, or the proposal that is on the table is that all of these are to be moved forward into this public setting, and it's not an absolute you will or shall in these things. So, Board Member Janet Cannon.
Thank you, Chair. I have a two-part question. I just would like you to please address for me the financial ramifications of the idea of having a provisional charter for 3 to 5 years that would then become evergreen, and then also providing the authority and funding for the authorizer to appoint a neutral receiver in the event of school closure. Can you just address what the financial ramifications of each of those concepts are?
Sure.
Please, Angie.
Would you like me to try? Okay. And this is also something that the State Charter School Board was interested in pursuing and had discussed in their board meetings before it was discussed in our Charter School Task Force. And so our State Charter School Board friends would probably be the best ones to answer this. But we are, if not the only state, one of very few states who currently, once we, meaning an authorizer, opens a school or enters into a charter agreement, we're one of very few that's kind of what we call evergreen or forever, eternal, until you close the school. Most states do exactly what is being proposed here, where a charter school for the first, 3 to 5 years, whatever that time period being, is kind of in a conditional or provisional status. So as far as funding implications, I think the biggest thing that we heard as a task force, and Chair, you can correct me or other board members who were present, is the funding for buildings and property, et cetera. So it does make it a little less secure for those developers and those who are building the buildings. But in some ways, right now, if you've got a school that starts up, we have had a couple of schools. I know that the State Charter School Board actually has a hearing next week on one, a newer school, that they are considering closing. And so you can see that even if you have an evergreen agreement, if a charter school has financial struggles in those first couple of years, and that's usually when I think authorizers have seen schools have financial struggles, is in those first couple of years. AISU is also early on. Then those bondholders or those who are buying the land and the property are taking on that risk as is already. But I think that's the number one implication of an evergreen versus 3 to 5 years, is just how that affects the property acquisition.
Yeah, Scott did.
And I did, you saw me lean towards Angie, and hopefully you're seeing how we're demonstrating just how linked we are with policy and finance. So I'd just like to address that. We want to support early on, the opening of the charter school. By doing this, I feel strongly that it would bring SCSB staff and USB staff together, and of course the State Charter School Board staff itself, into measuring and allowing for and helping and support those first 1, 2, 3 years of opening and implementation. Also, I'm not sure how all the board members are aware of this, but I'm the designee of the superintendent to serve on the Utah Charter School Finance Authority. right? And my experience there has been, you know, we want to make sure as a conduit for bonding, if you will, by the charter schools. I just feel strongly that by going down with this recommended path, it puts a lot of emphasis and support, again, I use that word strongly, support to the charter school for success in those first 1 to 3 years, you know, by having the ability to pay a lot of attention to what agreements they're entering into, that, you know, because if you begin right, then you'll end right. If you don't begin right, then you won't end right, right? So that's really how I feel. That's my perspective as your finance advisor, you know, to this too, but it supports both policy and the financial implications, man.
The other part of the question was the receivership
Yeah.
piece. Angie, did you want to?
Just one other thing I was going to mention, another benefit, I think, of a proposal with this 3 to 5 year provisional status is it gives that charter school probably a little bit more of a tighter relationship with their authorizer for those
Right.
first 3 to 5 years, and gives the authorizer probably more of an opportunity to do coaching and training and to kind of provide feedback that the charter school's more likely to take, I don't mean to say seriously, but take into consideration, because they know that there's still another step that they go through to become non-provisional. And so I imagine it gives not only a tighter relationship between USBE and the State Charter School Board or other authorizer, but a tighter connection between the authorizer and the charter school during those years to work together to make sure, like Deputy Superintendent Jones stated, a very strong beginning for that school so that they're set well. So,
Follow up. Return it
Does
back.
that mean that, how does that protect state dollars? I'm just thinking as someone over state dollars, how does the provisional status protect state taxpayers' dollars that are going to charters? And how does the neutral receiver protect state dollars from waste?
Yeah. So for the so I'll start with the opening, if you will, of a charter school. What it does is it allows us, all of us, authorizer and staff here, you as the board, and our represented, you know, as we represent you, that in those early years, we can establish, you know, that strict budget that will make them successful. And in that, by beginning right, that's where we get the protection of the dollars, ma'am. Is that, you know, we're learning, you know, the fantastic interaction in the group. It was rough, and, you know, I probably got seriously unfriended a lot on Facebook from it, but, you know, it's okay. You know, it's okay because we are learning and we're improving, right? And we will get there. But to your point, this particular recommendation, among the others as well, will foster that protection of taxpayer dollars early on, and then also it mitigates against risk of some of the issues that we've seen, that all authorizers have seen. I tend to just completely go state charter school board, but there's other authorizers that by identifying those risks early on and setting conditions for success, that we will protect the money much, much better. Now, if I may, Chair, proceed to the receivership question.
please.
Right?
before you move
Okay,
to
go
receiver,
ahead.
can I just say one more thing?
Yeah.
I did get some information, just clarifying that we, right now, are the only state in the country that has an evergreen status. The majority of other states actually have a renewal process that's rolling perhaps every 5 years throughout the life of the charter school. And what we understand is this is kind of a compromise between what we currently have and not necessarily going to having something every 5 years, you know, forever, but at least at the beginning having this one provisional status. So we are the only the only state currently that has the evergreen status. So I wanted to just add that.
Yeah, and as far as receivership goes, I mean, there's some more details I really believe we need to work out, and we will work out. However, you know, we are a learning and improving organization. So, you know, the recent closures have indicated to us that by, you know, making this recommendation, it will allow for us to, when or if, you know, and hopefully it doesn't happen, but if, you know, a charter school closes, that receivership process would also make it so that we end right. I mean, first and foremost, even above the financial aspects of a closure. We want to take care of the students, right? We are very responsible, and we want to ensure taxpayer dollars are protected. That's always there as well. But the transition of students is just as important as well. And by moving into or towards or this recommendation for receivership, I think we're actually going to be able to conscientiously protect both. We're going to be able to conscientiously protect both the student and the finances, and then also, you know, with closure, there could be some great ideas that come up on, you know, because we've all discussed how challenging it is for either other charter schools or local districts to absorb, if you will, or transition those students. By going down this road and making these recommendations, we can further develop that receivership process so that there may be ideas on how we can foster funding going to gaining charter schools or gaining districts. I mean, I can't make any promises at this point, but you know, when I walked out of the task force, I felt really good about where we were at coming out of the task force for future development of the receivership process in the interest of both the student and taxpayer dollars. So I can't really say, you know, this is absolutely the thing, because I think we still need to work out some details with that. That's fair.
There's a lot of
Yeah,
details.
There are.
This is high level
Yeah.
to move forward in committees and have more and more of this type of discussion of who, what, when, how, and to what depth, so. Okay, board member Cindy Davis.
I just wanted to speak for a minute about the FASB-GASB accounting practices. I haven't read the most recent report from the auditor, but the original one was looking at three prongs that what constitutes a government entity. And our government entities use GASB accounting practices. However, there is nothing that precludes a 501c3 from using GASB accounting standards, which are the government accounting standards. And I think it is important to note that some of our most conservative states, like Texas and Florida, are moving toward government accounting standards for their charter schools. Even North Carolina, whose charter schools are 501c3s, are moving toward GASB accounting practices and have gone so far as having the state treasurer create fictional kind of charter schools and accounts to teach and train their charters how to report in GASB financial standards. And I think one thing is also important to remember, that FASB accounting reporting is meant to, for the end user really to be the donors. And GASB accounting reporting is for the end user to be the taxpayers. And I think the distinction matters because I asked our folks to pull the data from the last 2 years of what our charter schools have reported. And 0.5% of our charter schools had any more than 10% in their revenue be from donors. So our charter schools, while they are a 501c3, are funded almost entirely by taxpayer dollars. And in fact, they are using a modified accrual accounting anyway, which is recommended by GASB, and FASB is recommending a full accrual accounting. So I just think there are a lot of things to look at as we move forward, and as our folks have said, there will continue to be work, but just a little bit of background on that piece, because there was some question about that latest letter.
Board member Bolter.
Thank you. I know there are differences with GASB and FASB. My big concern is that because the auditor's report came out 2 days ago, I don't know why it wasn't placed on the board docs. That's really concerning to me. I would have liked to have looked at that in their recommendations, because my understanding in recently texting back and forth with him is that he had some concerns. His office came up with some concerns, fundamental concerns, with GASB versus FASB, and I feel like we should have had a chance to read over that as a board before moving forward with all of these recommendations. And obviously in a text, he can't tell me all the issues, but 2 days was plenty of time to place these things on board docs for us to review further and compare and see what their concerns were.
Let me just speak to that really quick. The recommendations, the task force is done.
I understand that.
The auditor and staff and that, we're all in every single meeting in numbers. And these consensus statements were put together, and it's clear the auditor has got an opinion here that he posted, was it yesterday?
That we should read.
What's that?
That we should read and review.
I hope you do, because when we,
Prior
but it
to
doesn't change, the recommendations is not that this board goes to FASB or stays in FASB or goes to GASB. The recommendations of the board is to take it to committee and have more discussion, in which I'm sure the auditor may, we could definitely invite him in. But this is what came from a lot of hours from the task force in getting to that place, what right looks like, and truly the difference, and this could be argued, if you're a proponent of FASB and also a proponent of GASB. The reality is the consideration of GASB is to best position charter schools in a place. It's not a guarantee, but to best position them in a place of success and accountability and transparency and some other items like that. The list goes on, and more of that is going to be talked about, I'm sure, in whatever standing committee this gets an assignment to. This is not the end game. This is the beginning. This is what came out of the task force. We're going to take it, and then this board, through committee and other actions, is going to decide if they want to go with these recommendations or not, or how far they want to go. I don't see this as going against what the auditor is wanting to do or not wanting to do. This is what came from the task force, that this board asked to work on these things and come back with recommendations by December 5th or 6th or whatever it was. And that's what we're doing right now, is presenting that so that you can have further discussion in other standing committees. So did you have a follow-up or?
Yes. So in the motion, it's to accept task force recommendations and direct board leadership to facilitate action related to the recommendations, including assigning potential action items to standing committees. So that would not include these additional consensus statements, because those are not recommendations, or?
Those are, the consensus
Those are
statements
part
are
of-
part of the supporting of those recommendations from the task force that will follow whatever happens, and for board members to use and/or public to use in their discussions in our standing committees and board meetings as this moves forward.
Again, I'm just going to state that I'm going to vote no on this just because I haven't had a chance to read over what the auditor has said as far as GASB and FASB. I feel like I don't have all the information to make a clear decision.
And I just want to assure the board and reassure back to you that you're not making a vote today on GASB or FASB.
But we're moving forward that recommendation.
You're moving forward to facilitate some kind of action with the task force making these recommendations, but the board has the final say in what we do, same as the legislature and other bodies. This is not a binding thing. This is saying this is going to come out, and it's going to go to standing committees for action. Okay, and let me go to Angie first.
Chair, thank you. I just thought it might be helpful to kind of distinguish the difference between maybe the auditor's draft alert versus a recommendation for policy change. The audit alert, or what Auditor Dougal is giving opinions on, is the status of the law as is. and his opinion of interpretation of the law today. Versus I think the task force's recommendations are about what the law should be and potentially clarified either by the legislature in statute or by the board in a board rule. And so it is an interesting opinion, and but I guess the question is, one is about the status of the way the law is now versus what the law should be. I didn't know if that would help. There are many opinions. I think Board Member Davis gave another example of some of the sentiments of other task force members about why they think, although maybe the law of the day is FASB, why maybe the law moving forward should be GASB, and that would have to happen in either a bill or a board rule. So this document in and of itself is not going to change. If you support this document, these recommendations today, you would still have to either approve a board rule or the legislature would have to pass a bill in order for it to be legally binding. And that's all. I just want to make that clarification, just to support what you're saying, Chair Huntsman, that this motion today would not unilaterally subject or move that forward. We'd have to either enact a board rule or legislation to do that.
We have other board members that want to weigh in on the conversation. Board Member Jenny Earl.
So my question is, I understand that we've had some abuses of the finances previously, and maybe some of those are ongoing. But my question has to do with when this is under number 1, and I'm just curious what the charter board and some of the public, other members felt about this. But we're talking about the provisional charter for 3 to 5 years. Do they anticipate that there will be individuals who won't want to invest because it is not maybe? Do you understand what I'm saying? That they're going, okay, this is provisional, so why would I put an investment into a charter school if there's an uncertainty whether the state or the charter board or the community is even going to support this if it's under this idea of a provisional? I'm just asking what the dialogue was around that area. Anyways.
And I'm trying to go back to the
Sure.
27 hours of discussion that we had. And but I would say that 49 other states have something similar to this model, and investment is occurring, schools are opening, properties being acquired. So I think that what you see in other states is showing that there still is investment, charter schools are still opening. So that's I don't know if you have more to add to that. That was mostly.
I'd like to add my perspective, again, as the designee on the Utah Charter School Finance Authority. And, Treasurer Damshin may correct me if I'm wrong, but typically we don't bond until a charter school's been in operation for roughly 3 years, right? We don't do that. I feel strongly, and I'll echo the same sentiment that I gave to Board Member Cannon through the chair, is that by doing this, and getting the focus on them, that when it comes to that point, did they apply for bonds through the conduit, through the Utah Charter, it will actually enable a better result in their, interest rate. Or, because we've focused and we've given them the support and the attention they need. We began right, and then, progressing toward that so that bondholders or potential investors go, well, great, I can see all of the steps and risks that were mitigated on there. So I think it's actually conducive to not only future investors, but at decent rates, right? They could do it because we've done so well setting conditions and standards for success.
So is it okay if I make a comment?
follow.
Okay, so if I'm understanding, you're saying that we think that this will put them on their best foot for a number of years.
do.
They're going to be on their top game so
Right.
that they'll be able to, okay.
But
So I'm
it-
just trying to make sure that it doesn't do the opposite of that, or at least
Well-
understand if that's what the dialogue
Yeah,
was taking
but
place.
let me
So,
also be
okay.
clear as well. I also feel that it's a way of ensuring that, or allowing for a decision-making that, hey, it's just not working, right? That
Mm-hmm.
the particular funding that you get or things like that, because there's always risks of misuse of restricted fund, or not misuse, but unallowable use of restricted funds. I really think it's a very good balanced approach so that, at some point, the decision could be made to, fund and continue or do it. I really feel that way. And it gives them enough time You know, it's because if there's changes in staff or different things like that, that we've also seen that, you know, more or less contribute to some of the issues that we've seen, we can respond and act, you know, in regard to the support aspect of it. However, if things are not progressing well, then we don't enter into an evergreen status, and then it becomes more difficult down the road to do that. So
Okay.
I think it's a balanced approach, man.
Thank you, that helps.
Board Member Linda Hansen.
I was really glad to see this come through. I think I've been on 3 or 4 charter school task forces, and this task force really accomplished something, so that's awesome. I have a question about the provisional status, and, you know, one of the things that has concerned me since I've been on the board was we get expansion requests, like if a charter has only been in operation maybe a year or 2 or maybe 3, and then we get these expansion requests and we don't know. Did you guys talk about that at all? About what provisional status really means and what it means to be evergreen? Are they going to be able to come in and ask for expansion before their provisional status is up?
Sure, I could answer that. We didn't discuss that in the task force. And currently, as you stated, there's nothing that legally prohibits them from requesting it. It's been something in practice that the board, back when we would approve or not expansion requests, that as you know, the board was hesitant to do unless there was an exceptional circumstance. But that was not a discussion of the task force.
I think, just a follow-up, I just think that would be something that when we put this through rule or statute or whatever, that would be something that we'd want to address.
Chair, and you know, I really feel strongly that by way of the recommendations and then leadership, you know, going with the committees, that these kind of details that Board Member Hansen has brought up would get basically flushed out, you know, so that we could do the rule. Can you do it? Can you not? Things like that.
And I think
strongly
on the
about that.
charter board as the authorizer, is they're putting all of this together also.
Okay,
It'll be
yeah.
flushing it, it'll be also
Yeah.
there, it'll be demanded, I'm sure, from the charter community, what does right look like, and how do I stay out of that provisional status, or what puts me into it? So those things will be better defined. Vice Chair Brittany Cummins.
I just wanted to step back a little bit and recognize that when a task force comes together, there is a lot of work that goes into the consensus process. And so that final document that comes out of a task force it takes a lot of work to get there. And so when that gets onto a board doc or is publicized, it has to maintain that consensus that ended at that last meeting. And so it's very, all of those task force members can have different opinions, but we shouldn't put pressure on staff to assume that they should have to publicize or post opinions of different task force members that may diverge from the consensus that came out of that task force, the final vote. So I think we need to be very conscientious. While that information is valuable, and as we go forward in the process of making the decisions, final decisions based on the recommendations, but to assume that one task force member's recommendations or opinions should be posted to board docs, I think puts all other task force members in an uncomfortable position as far as posting or publicizing one opinion over another. Going back to GASB and FASB, I just want to ask, so one of the consensus statements talks about putting a delayed approach into it, and obviously there is some contention about this topic. So I'm curious if you can share a little bit about what was it about the implementation of GASB that causes so much rub or that would be problematic for those who are doing it? So can you speak to what was that conversation and why will it take time? What are the roadblocks that people anticipate running into?
Yes, thank you. I'm going to start, and then Scott, or
Okay.
Deputy Jones is going to do the second part of this. So I did want to bring to your attention, part of the recommendation to move to GASB were 2 things. Number one, there was definitely a request from the schools that were represented in the task force that there be some transition time and potentially an appropriation for software and other supports, because the GASB requirements do at times provide different requirements for software and tools for accounting. And so one of the recommendations, which is not in the list at the bottom of this document, but it's actually embedded in the recommendation earlier on, but you'll see it also in the consensus statements, is that the legislature, board, and the authorizers all work to provide support to, if we do, in fact, and when I say we, either the legislature or the board through a board rule, require charter schools to move forward with GASB, is to either provide some transition time and maybe phase that in with some pilot schools to begin with, and/or money, an appropriation to provide the tools, software needed. And so that was part of the recommendation. And the task force left it kind of open by saying that they recognize it might need to be phased in over time, or to have the date of actual requirement be out in the future to give schools time to prepare. But is that
Yeah.
helpful?
You have a follow-up?
So you're saying the main roadblock was tools, tools to implement?
And training.
Yeah,
Tools and
change.
training?
yeah, if I may, Chair?
Yes.
Yeah, I echo that sentiment. It was tools and training. There was also some considerations or concerns as well, as, you know, some charter schools are bonded, right, or multiple charter schools are bonded. So by switching the reporting, it may and then there's other that I don't want to get into the details of for any other reason than it's accounting terminology, and it would turn into probably a training session here. But there's retirement type issues, or retirement fund type issues and things like that, where, you know, it could result in, say, a negative balance that might have second or third level unintended or consequential effects on bond covenants that are already in place, right? So there were those aspects too. So that was, I feel, why we took what Angie described as a slowest smooth, smoothest fast approach, so that the transition would be slow in the sense of, you know, ensuring that the tools and the training were provided, but then also too the sentiments of, you know, well, what would this cause and what second or third level effects would it mean, that we could communicate those in a fashion so that, you know, we wouldn't unintentionally, you know, scare bondholders or do anything like that with the, you know, the subsequent report that came out under that standard. That's why I feel that we went down that road, so.
Yeah, one more.
So were there any conversations with bondholders as to whether or not, like, were they contacted, or any of those who hold current bonds, are they willing to kind of go through that process with charter schools of balancing the one reporting standard into another?
So I recall, and Scott and I are trying to pull again from that, but the treasurer's office did reach out, it was my recollection, to bond counsel and asked, and they said there would need to be some amendments made, but they didn't see it, the treasurer's office anyway, didn't see it as being concerning. But
Right.
it's hard to speak
just
for
one-
those who
Yeah.
were there when,
Yeah.
In which that question would come out in committee,
Yeah.
and then you could get that public opinion and not have it be.
Yeah, so if I'm, just for clarity, when Deputy Superintendent Stallings says amendments, I believe she's talking about the amendments to financial statements from going to FASB to GASB, which, to my point, you know, might change like a net asset amount, or, you know, something along that line. But bond counsel says, you know, as long as we're, you know, very transparent and communicating clear, I don't anticipate that. But by taking the approach of moving slowly towards it, right, we would always just mitigate against that risk of an unintended consequence, so.
Okay. Board Member Lear?
Thank you. I had a couple of questions and then a statement. In reading this, there were two things that I had hoped that the task force would have talked about, and I don't see anything in here about it, and if I'm missing it, it's kind of a yes or no question. I don't need a long explanation. But two of the things that I wished there'd been some discussion of, and some consensus, or at least some recognition of the discussion, were, one, the balance of authority between the state charter board and the state board. I see nothing about that in there. It seems to be the elephant in the room, and yet it wasn't in 9 meetings discussed, as I see that. Is that true? Am I missing something?
so it was discussed. We actually looked at the authority and powers of both entities. However, no recommendations were reached. And that's related to the last recommendation that the board continue to discuss governance, oversight and monitoring of charter schools. So yes, it was discussed, but there were no recommendations that came out of
And just a
it.
quick follow-up to that one. So when you say it was discussed, you mean that you laid out what the law says about it?
Yes, and then there were a couple of proposals that were proposed kind of quickly at the end, but it was too meaty to come to any kind of recommendation by
And
the
too
time.
important, maybe?
Both, yeah.
Okay. And second question,
So let me jive in on the one thing, if you could reference what you're talking about, authority and how this is played out. There's an exhibit. Thank you for bringing that exhibit up. This is the only way to describe in a simple terms.
forgive me, but that looks more like Rube Goldberg than anything else to
And,
me.
and there's there's oversight arrows, and then also the distribution of funds. And so it was fascinating. And I'd like to thank staff for taking this to a great spot to have it very simple. All you got to do is follow the color of the line, the color of the money, and et cetera, of who does what, when, and how. And so we'll probably be using that in our standing committees also, as you want. It isn't as complicated as it seems, but it is a reality that
I don't.
we got
just-
consensus
Just to
on.
say, I don't think it's complicated at all, and I don't really think it's requires that kind of a chart, but that's just my opinion. But my second question, I just wanted to see how much discussion there was, more than resolving it today or in this report. But my second question was, I wondered if there was any discussion of the comparative effectiveness of charter schools chartered by school districts versus those chartered by state authorizers.
No, there was
No
no
discussion.
discussion of that.
And thank you very much. And then my third comment is just, I think it is so unfortunate, again, and I know I've belabored and bemoaned this, so unfortunate that there was not the opportunity for the public to hear this discussion. I think there would be a lot more comfort generally from me as a board member if I'd been there, heard the interaction of various stakeholders, and heard that for myself, and didn't see this compilation of many, many hours. And I personally will never again support a task force that's not open to the public to some degree. So thank you.
Board Member Bolter?
I am just going to ask that we table this issue until next month, just for the sole purpose of, it's my understanding, and it isn't just one person's opinion, it is the state auditor's office that they did. And my understanding is that there is fundamental issues between GASB and FASB as it relates to 501c3s, which is the distinction that charter schools have. So I would just ask that we table this until next month, until we have more
Are you
things
making
that
a
we can
motion to
read.
table?
Yes. I
A
move that
motion
we
to
table.
table, is there a second? So vote, all in favor of tabling, say aye. Yeah, let's go into a discussion. I'm sorry, I'm rushing it. Discussion to the table. Table in this. Board Member Lear?
My question would be, what would that accomplish if the board's just accepting these recommendations as a beginning point? What do we hope to accomplish by, and then what would be the downside of tabling it and not moving forward today? So two parts to that question.
Okay.
Maybe Michelle can respond to one, and if that's okay,
Well,
Chair.
she kind of spoke to it when she was making it, but do you want to speak to your motion and her question,
Yeah,
Board Member
and then the
Bolter?
second part, maybe
So
somebody
the reason
else.
why I would ask to table it is because not only are we accepting recommendations, but we're directing leadership to facilitate action towards those recommendations. And one of those recommendations is to facilitate action towards requiring that charter schools move to GASB. And I'd like to see the fundamental differences between GASB and FASB as it pertains to 501c3s before we ask that they move forward with those recommendations. That's my reason for
That's helpful.
tabling it.
Thank you.
Okay. Board Member Bolter, the motion would be to postpone so we can get into, we're not tabling it would come back, so it's postpone
Okay,
until.
postpone, yes, until
so
next
to
month.
re-clarify,
Thank you,
is the
Lorraine.
second still good? Who seconded? Okay. Vice Chair Brittany Cummins?
So the concern I have with postponing this particular motion is that is the task force going to reconvene and make new recommendations that we would then therefore look at? Or who is going to gather information in order to, like, who from the task force, or who is going to authorize what information to gather and who's going to give it in what form? Correct. So my question is how would that change the task force recommendations? Because the task force recommendations are to begin the conversation of GASB versus FASB in a committee. And so all of that auditor's information could come to that committee and we could have that discussion. Because otherwise, if we read and we decide, oh, it should be FASB or it should be GASB, then we're looking at changing the recommendation now before we've had a committee discussion. Does that make sense? I think we're trying to make a decision before we have actually put this in committee, when the motion before us today is to put this in committee so we can have that discussion based on the auditor's information, new opinion, new information that is outside of the task force recommendations. And so I'm worried that we postpone this.
Here, to phase into going to GASB, that's what we've been talking about. And it would be a slow phase in. It does not say anything about discussing between the difference of FASB and GASB. It is phase in, that's what we continue to talk about. So I guess I'm just confused as to what the actual.
So to finish, in order to phase in GASB or FASB, rule or law has to change. We can't, as leadership, we can't just say, make it be so. And so there has to be a rule or a law change. And so that is where this would go to committee or through the legislative process. And so we are not changing anything today. We don't have the authority to change it based on this recommendation. And so that's why.
And let me just add to a couple other things. This is not going back to the task force because the motion that was made, there was amendments to the motion before it was started that this task force work would be completed by this board meeting for the purpose of whatever comes from the task force so that it could get out into committee and get started into these other processes. And so it's, to come back, we're not even, Scott, did you want to?
Yeah, I just recalled too from the task force that by way of this process, you know, going to committee, there was also, this goes back to Vice Chair Cummins' question about, you know, what were the concerns of the, you know, the transition, if any, to GASB. We would also allow for more time to get, you know, concrete data or information on what the cost of the transitions would be. You know, how much would it be for the software, different things like that. That was one of the important pieces too. You know, I'd also like to add that by way of this process too, you know, from a staff perspective, that these discussions between GASB and FASB occurred just really in depth. So while I understand there's also the audit, there's the auditor's alert message, there's also a 2013 memo from then Attorney General John Swallow that said to State Finance Director John Reedhead that said that charter schools are governmental entities. So, you know, we'd need to introduce that as well. I feel strongly that by going through this committee process, slow is smooth, smooth is fast, that we would be able to continue to flush these details out and arrive at, you know, to the leadership's point of, you know, recommendations to rule that the board would have to approve, or any recommendations we make to code, the board would still have to be, you know, engaged with that and be on top of that as well, so.
Okay, the motion before the board is to postpone this item, and that's what we're speaking to. Board Member Scott Hansen?
I'll speak against the motion to postpone. We put together a task force. We gave them a job to do. We gave them a timeline. They've come back with recommendations. The state auditor's office was represented on the task force, apparently attended. There's names listed in the people who were there. For them to come out after a recommendation is drafted with something else that they want us to consider to try to undermine this, or whatever they're trying to do. I just think that's disingenuous. I mean, that process went by, and we had 9 weeks to discuss this. This is a recommendation. I say we vote on it and get on with it.
Okay, the motion before the board is to postpone, so I'm going to call that to a vote. Not seeing any discussion. All in favor to postpone, say aye. Those opposed? No. Will the ayes raise their hand to postpone? 2, okay. Okay, the motion before the board is that the board thank the Charter School Task Force for its work and report, accept the task force recommendations, and direct board leadership to facilitate actions related to the recommendations, including assigning potential action items to standing committees. Not seeing any other discussion, so let's vote. Oh, Board Member Janet Cannon.
I just wanted to say that as I went through these additional consensus statements, that I see in here the State Charter School Board stepping up as the primary authorizer of charter schools to take a lot of responsibility for their success and for their finances. And I appreciate that, and I think that's commendable, and I just wanted to make that statement.
Okay. Okay, I'll restate the motion. Board Member Cindy Davis.
I just want to echo that. I was so impressed with them during this task force, and most of these actually came from them, and I have pretty high respect, I have to say.
Okay. Okay, the motion before the board, I'm going to call it to a vote. The motion before the board is that the board thank the Charter School Task Force for its work and report and accept the task force recommendations and direct board leadership to facilitate actions related to the recommendations, including assigning potential action items to standing committees. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed? No. We have, with the noes, I think there's one? One. Okay, motion passes. Thank you. Again, many thanks to the task force. We have